Welcome back to Getting Real, the show where we uncover the human side of success, failure, and the relentless pursuit of progress. Today's guest is Steve Robinson, founder and CEO of the Supply Chain Project. This is an organization that exclusively works with nonprofits that are focused on the humanitarian space to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of supply chains. Steve's career spans 4 decades of global supply chain leadership with experience at Walmart, UPS, and Transplace, amongst others. He's worked at every level of logistics, from the warehouse floor to the corporate boardroom, leading transformations worth billions while pioneering some of the most impactful systems in modern retail and manufacturing. Today, he's blending that operational excellence with purpose, helping organizations align profitably for global good. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Dan, it's a pleasure.
Thanks so much for being here. So take me on this journey from the warehouse to the war room. You started your career literally moving product, UPS, trucking terminals, distribution, fresh out of The Ohio State University. Before helping shape global strategy at Walmart and beyond, what did those early years, that hands-on experience, teach you about leadership that still applies today?
Yeah, Dan, so, UPS was my first job. I stood in line for 4 hours to be seasonal help, the Alum Creek facility in Columbus, Ohio. And so first it taught patience because it was like 4 hours for a job application. But UPS was a great place to work. This is like 1976. And what I learned at UPS was that the details matter. It was a data-driven company and they managed the details. And you're immediately grounded in, precision, in detail, in engineered standards, and just the capacity to inspect what you expect was how they built that organization. So yeah, it was sort of a great introduction to a world that I didn't know exists as a college student. But some years later, we figured it out.
So in my research, you describe supply chains as living ecosystems, not just systems. How did that perspective evolve as you moved from the warehouse to the executive suite?
Yeah, so I think that the reality is that supply chains have been around for many years, and the only effective way to really get things done. And so, if you ask, where that perspective came from, Dan, I'll tell you, it came out of maybe my childhood curiosity, understanding how things sort of arrived in my neighborhood. Okay, I don't mind sharing with you something I didn't share in my early career, but when I was in middle school, we were homeless, and I was living in Cleveland, Ohio, inner city school. My mother was a schizophrenic mother of three, very difficult to keep a job. And so there was a period when we were homeless. My mother literally took the condemned sign off of a condemned house and moved us in. And so even though Cleveland is the home of Superman, my childhood superheroes didn't wear capes. They knocked on your door at 3 o'clock in the morning and left a box of food, not really standing there to understand, that you're a kind of a struggling family and they're, going to take a photo op, but just really humanly stepping in with a point of need. So very early on, I was really curious in why, you know, how food and money and resources are distributed, where they come from, what are the decision factors around where they happen. Where did this box come from? This magic box that would sort of appear, and that just kind of started my curiosity. I went on to Ohio State and could have done a lot of different things, but as you can imagine, my undergrad was in agricultural economics because, again, this curiosity around how does food and money shape our world? Okay. That evolved into this conversation that you and I are having, which is a 45-year supply chain journey that I started back there when I first stood in line at UPS, and I'm still on that journey today.
Wow. I told you I tend to go off script with these things. That hit me right in the heart. The story that you just told. As you sit across from me right now in your office, what are you most proud of?
Well, obviously, family and the industry that we have, that was a trucking industry that, really now after COVID, people understand that supply chain moves the world. So proud to be, still actively able to contribute and and participate. I've worked for lots of companies and lots of brands, and I think the next thing I'm proud of is I've got a long list of people that I worked with and worked for, and in fact, some people that I brought into the industry that have gone on and had amazing careers. And so, you can't help but be.
Amazing. Now, let's talk about the evolution of supply chain. You were essentially Walmart's first chief supply chain officer before that role even existed. You introduced groundbreaking concepts like the must arrive by date and merchandise logistics, which have now become industry standards. Looking back now, what's changed the most in how we think about supply chain strategy, and what still hasn't changed enough?
Well, excellent. Let me correct that. The first ever head of supply chain for Walmart was a wonderful gentleman, Robert Bruce. And Robert Bruce had been in charge of replenishment and was a demand planning expert. And Robert was a great friend, and he was really sort of the pioneer, in the early days. As I came through, Robert graciously handed me the reins, but it was supply chain. I came out of the transportation area, and there were a lot of challenges, and it was a significant growth period. But I just want to make sure I set the record straight.
Yeah, I'm
Robert
sorry about
Bruce,
that.
wonderful individual. Unfortunately, we lost Robert last year, but those of us that knew him knew that he was an amazing pioneer. And Robert had pioneered something and really led it called CPFR, Collaborative Planning, Forecasting, and Replenishment. Okay. And so if I were to kind of go back to what, was really the first sort of stake that Walmart placed in the retail industry's transformation, I'm going to say it was Robert and some of the early leadership around CPFR. Now, as I came into that was significant strategy. As I sort of ascended and took that role, then there was a required amount of what I would call execution, where planning and forecasting met execution, asset management, right? Logistics. And that was really the genesis for, the must arrive by date.
When you think about the fragility we all witnessed during the pandemic, what lessons are still unlearned by most organizations today?
Yeah, you know, the pandemic, what lessons, I believe it is that planning and execution have to happen in the same room at the same time, right? And that demand and supply have to be indelibly tied. And so what we saw, I think, during the pandemic is we saw the mismatch where, for whatever reason, we'd gotten away from time supply, very focused to demand. So if I give you a little bit of history, years ago, most, cities were built with sort of an outer belt, and whatever fresh vegetables, agricultural products, even meat was sort of, very close to the city center where it was being consumed. Okay. And so it was daily replenishment, fresh vegetables, meat. We had butchers, we had bakers. Most of the restaurants would sort of carve their own products and, really take fresh produce and provide it. About 50, 60 years ago, consumer packaged goods companies start acquiring the brand. So today we have maybe 11 companies that own 93% of all the different brands you see as you walk through the center of the store, and a fair amount of the fresh milks and breads and vegetables and other things and meats that are on sort of the periphery. So what's happened is that we traded that natural synergy, that natural supply demand match for like hyper growth, maximum profitability. And we've taken the meat processing, for instance, that used to happen in every neighborhood and concentrated it at some 5,000 acre facility in Nebraska with lots of automation to take the meat and put it in these little packages, right, full of preservatives so we can ship it all over the world and still maintain the revenue and profitability. So our supply chain has gotten a bit more distorted as we move, demand further from supply because we're processing, many of the different products. And I think it's really been whether it's food that has been hyper regionalized or non-food items that used to be manufactured here that now have an extended supply chain. It's like 32 days of lead time from Asia to get back. So I think it's the extension of like the consumables and then the extension of, some of the non-consumables to bigger, broader, longer supply chains where we focus more on the manufacturing efficiency, less on coordinating demand and supply in real time.
So you're involved in numerous business endeavors right now. Can you give me an overview of sort of how these businesses are interlinked or supply chain at large and sort of the purpose and passion that's coming from you behind them?
Well, I talked a little bit about my background. So, I've had a pretty good career and met a lot of amazing people. But, I was sitting in my office at Starbucks where I was the VP of the Starbucks Center of Operations Excellence and looking at, what my next career move was. And so first, my grandkids are here in Silicon Valley, so I knew it was going to be somewhere here. But I migrated to a company, Gobble. It's a meal kit company, little bitty company, but really spent some time, there and just fell in love with the vibe here in Silicon Valley, right? These, young people that are taking brand new technologies like robotic process automation and Internet of Things you know, and now, AI and sort of repurposing it to bring this new capability forward in supply chain. So I'd say that supply chain has always been sort of a first mover, sort of incubator for new technologies, right? And new concepts. And because the world is a supply chain, there's lots of things to do.
Great. Well, the conversation inherently is going to move to AI at some point. So, how do you see AI and data intelligence redefining the future of logistics and manufacturing in your world?
Well, in order for me to answer that, I'll give you a little bit of context. So you asked earlier about some of the things that I'm working on. So the supply chain project, as you mentioned, our focus is working directly with humanitarian focused nonprofits. And if they are, collecting and distributing food, medical equipment, medical supplies, health and beauty aids, pharmaceuticals, ranging for shelter, then they're sort of our ideal customer profile. And, another point, Dan, the world is what I call at a point of peak need, right? You look forward between now and 2030, there's going to be an additional 700 million people that will be unhoused and struggling with food insecurity. Okay. And so you can reasonably say, not just because of COVID, not just because of wars, but you can just reasonably say that that's sort of where we're evolving to. We've not seen this level of income disparity in the world in 100 years. But on the other side, the world is what I call at peak waste. Okay, it's at peak waste. 45% of all the food is wasted. In fact, if you want to waste more food, donate it to a nonprofit who really lacks the ability to do an FDA recall or to maintain the cold chain, and they lack people, process, and technology that is really required for the mission. But what they do is every bit as challenging as what Walmart does, or at Starbucks, we had 70% market coffee worldwide. You might call that distribution intense. No much more so than feeding America, right? And so we're at peak need, we're at peak waste. One other data point, last year, the US generated $890 billion of retail returns, Dan. 890 billion. Okay. The prior year was 743 billion. My money is on the fact that by the end of 2025, we'll look back and see that the United States created $1 trillion or more of retail returns. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the preponderance of that returns, after it goes through the liquidators and goes through other approaches, it's by no means circular. It ends up in landfills all over the world. There are literally mountains of landfills in communities like Argentina and Ghana, where brand new clothing never worn before is just discarded, right? And so the world's at peak need and the world is at once at now what we're doing today with artificial intelligence is we're using artificial intelligence to sort of accelerate our ability to make decisions, but those decisions are governed by what I call an economic innovation height. What do I mean by that? So sitting here in Silicon Valley, and I've had 3 exits, and so what I'm telling you is that the investors really determine the trajectory of the innovation. You have something, let's just say it's Uber, great model, returned amazing returns for investors. Well, here in the Valley, innovation height isn't disintermediating that business. Innovation, inter, innovation height is lift. It is a certain amount of differentiation. It's defensively unique differentiation as long as it doesn't disrupt the economic model. So the constraint is the economic. Now, if that was a nonprofit, everything would be on the table. The need to return amazing returns to a VC or an investor would not constrain the things that you could reasonably look at and imagine as doable. But the economic constraint really constrains the economic height. So why do we have a world that's at peak waste and at peak need? And why is, the most amazing technology we've seen come along ever, AI, why is it being constrained and focused on doing more hyper production, hyper consumption that we know has already led to this world state where we have peak need and peak waste? Because it is the exclusive property of the investors. And I'm not saying that there's any malice there, but solving the world's problems has very little to do with increasing the wealth disparity between the people that can reasonably afford to invest in AI technology and then the rest of the populations that need to sort of inherit the benefit. Okay.
It's a silly question, but what is the solution? Because it's very disheartening to think that we have potential solutions and they can't get into play because of the economic disruption that would have to people that already have enough.
Yeah, so the solution is, my dad in my younger years was sort of a pragmatist. He had a fourth grade education. He was a painter, had been to the Navy. So he had all of these sayings that, were just how he passed on sage wisdom. And one of his sayings was, the answer is money. Now, what's the problem? Okay. And so the answer is, how do we take supply chains for good, doing the right thing, and make it as profitable, right? And as lucrative as sort of exploiting the world? I mean, again, I'm sitting here in the Valley, and some of the mantras that we use here is, first do no harm. Right. It's like, yeah, we want to build these massive businesses. We want to be commercial and let's just be capitalist and first do no harm. But beyond that, let's just go make a lot of money. I'm okay with that. The new mantra, I think, for AI has got to be, let's just do some damn good. Let's let humans impose their humanity on AI in a way that trains it and expects it to actually do some good. And let's build businesses around that. I'm really excited that I've recently partnered with just one organization that's attempting to do that, is to say, okay, we've got what is effectively some of the most powerful technology that's partially here and still in the pipeline that's ever existed on the planet. How do we harness it and train it while it's still young to grow up and not just cater to the top of the economic run, but to build capabilities that can lift humanity, right? And so I think that you'll see a few of those come to market and we'll see kind of how they do. But my money is that people are going to be all in betting on AI that doesn't just make humanity rich or a subset rich, but makes us better.
Yeah, and so you mentioned before we got into the conversation sort of the healthcare lens. Can you talk about that from a logistics standpoint?
Well, there's a lot from a logistics standpoint, but I'll start and tell you my framework is what I call the human supply chain. And so I start with this assumption now. I start with this assumption that every human has a right for food, for, for shelter and have just some basic human needs met, particularly again when we're living in a world where so much of that is wasted. We're the only, modern civilized country that can't really find a way to offer at least a base level of healthcare to everyone. It's partly a policy problem, but it's also, it's a supply chain problem as well. Any global supply demand mismatch is a supply chain problem, right? And there's probably some logisticians and supply chain, people somewhere saying, we've got a technology, we got a business process, we have an operational paradigm, we know what the constraint is. It's just supply chain is going to save the world. I'm absolutely convinced of it. In fact, I own the URL. Supply chain saves the world. I own that URL, bought it 10 years ago. So Dan, healthcare is really a function of access and affordability. We've got some of the best and the smartest, medical professionals, clinicians, researchers, medical device producers, pharmaceutical companies. We've got some of the best in the world. Okay. But again, they're supported broadly by markets, and they have to take this incredibly expensive R&D, monetize it, but do it in a way that covers the fixed costs. So it's pretty expensive to get the fixed cost coverage when you're experimenting with creating new drugs and new medical devices. But after that happens, these are some of the most lucrative businesses we have. And they're just getting better and better at bringing new solutions and other things to market. But because it's market driven, there's other things that happen. We find that there's a better market, a more sustainable long-term market for treating certain illnesses than eradicating them. Okay.
Uh,
So that's a challenge. Not exactly a primary supply chain challenge, but we call that shaping demand. So let's just say that they become expert at not just responding to demand with supply, but certain industries are expert at shaping demand. Okay. And then bringing the supply and perpetuating whatever that is. So we do a fair amount of demand shaping and demand sensing, here in the medical space. But then the other part of it now, again, is that it's a distribution intense kind of business, right? So down where we're delivering, PP&E and durable medical equipment and all of those things, we're no longer manufacturing them the way we were. I think we all learned during COVID that most of the PPE and a lot of the durable medical equipment was still being manufactured, in Asia. A long lead time requiring a long inventory buffers, a lot of transport that sort of drives up the cost of a 2 cents item. It's $2 now to support it all. So the supply chain response is make it closer to home. Okay? Make it closer to home, funnel the demand into our own manufacturing so that we can build facilities that are big enough, that can scale, that can bring the unit cost down. So, I think the more we make here, the better. Our pharmaceuticals are made in India from raw materials that they source from China. Our PP&E and durable medical equipment is made, in different areas across Asia. Now, in some areas, tell me if I'm talking too much, but in some areas, it makes sense to continue to source, from those locations, right? Nobody consumes more shoes than the US. We have more shoes per person, per closet than anyone in the world.
yeah.
No one consumes more toys. I think our kids have toys that are like 20 to 1. Every time there's a movie or a new character or a new season or a new holiday, new product development and introduction floods thousands of toys. Nobody consumes the toys that we consume. But over the last 40 years, when we were like moving products to Asia, 40 years ago, 1995, okay, 30 years ago, 1995, the US labor rate was, 80 times more expensive than their labor in China. Okay. It was crazy. So if you were
Uh,
chasing everyday low price or attempting to bring your assortment economically to the market, then you moved your production there. Okay. Made a lot of sense. They have the lowest labor rates on the planet, and we're investing in the capacity to manufacture, right? Well, today, you know, China's no longer the largest trading partner with the US. Mexico is. Mexico has a lower labor rate than the industrialized regions of China. There's still some lower rates in some of the rural areas, but Mexico's pretty good. Mexico has really stepped up their game. They can manufacture a lot of stuff. You can really look at bringing your finished goods assembly back to the Western Hemisphere and, parking in Mexico, right? Who's got the lowest labor rates in Latin America right now? I mean, educated labor in manufacturing facilities that are close enough to the US to matter, the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic has some of the least expensive labor, or what we call the best labor arbitrage um, for the degree of English speaking talent. And so if you did like cut and sew in the Dominican Republic, their labor is cheaper than Mexico's, whose labor is cheaper than China. So all of the hype that I think that you're hearing, you know, Mexico plus one or I'm sorry, China plus one or China plus two, we've spent over $40 billion over the last 30 years investing in this infrastructure in the Panama Canal, Mexico, Dominican Republic. There's four major free trade agreements that make it all make sense. And instead of running from China, people should be running back to Latin America, Mexico plus two, Mexico, Panama, Dominican Republic, healthcare. Dominican Republic has really started manufacturing medical devices. I would say they're probably very close, knocking on the door to being the best place to manufacture medical devices in the Western Hemisphere. It's just a matter of time before they'll be manufacturing durable medical equipment in Mexico and PP&E in Mexico, Dominican, and even parts of the U.S. So bringing the supply chain home for some of the critical inputs in healthcare is important. Pharmaceuticals are going to be next, but that's a bit more of a stretch.
Has anybody told you that you should think about running for president?
Nobody that likes me, for sure.
That's funny. I want to expand a little bit more on supply chains as a tool for global good. Talking big picture, the supply chain project is tackling massive global challenges. Can you talk about how agile supply chains became the catalyst for solving these sort of problems rather than contributing to them?
Yeah, supply chains are just the way things move around the world. They from the early days, farm to fork. So supply chains are always there. They're like nitrogen. You hear a lot about oxygen, but nitrogen is the most prevalent, kind of chemical in the universe. And so supply chains are always there. It's how we get from here to there. And 7% of everything you see, touch, feel, eat, look at some point, had major supply chain involvement. So let's just say that, that's ambient. We're just getting better at understanding how to pick and choose where we apply and how we apply this discipline of supply chain. There's about, someone would say, 400 million people around the world today that are working and operating in the quote unquote supply chain industry. And they're all working for their particular companies and their industries and their regions and whatever. But collectively, when we sort of pull them together and we say, just for a moment, while your company, your industry, your village, your town, your plant, is when collectively, what if we sort of like all pull together, right? And, what could we do if we, for a second, were not competing for resources and agendas, but working together? So I think what we're really talking about is supply chain is ambient, but how do we create a community of interest and a community of practice around two or three things that we can all contribute to and participate in, right? What if we had 1% of all empty transport capacity sort of set aside and earmarked for humanitarian issues? We, right? What if we just had that? What if we had 1% of the excess storage that's never consumed earmarked for humanitarian issues? So this isn't really that hard. It's not a radical change. if you peer into any distribution organization where they're deploying, process, technology, and assets, there is an underused component. Because if you're going to promise a service level, then you have to always maintain enough of a buffer to be able to absorb like whatever the dynamic demand variability is. And so if you're a private fleet, you got empty miles. If you're a storage location, like in your neighborhood, they're going to run about 92% of their capacity. If you got a freezer, if you got a truck, if you got a red wagon or a damn bike, it's not being utilized 100% of the time. So what if we could actually, pull some of that excess capacity and just, earmark a little bit of it expressly for these humanitarian issues? It's not incrementally more cost, it's dramatically less waste. But it does require people being human or training their AI or whatever to say, yeah, we're going to prioritize that.
Again, I don't know why you're not running for president, but do you think that we're finally reaching the point where sustainability and profitability can coexist in a supply chain strategy?
Yeah, I think, Dan, the moment we begin to articulate how people, make money, save money, then it becomes a reality. And, without being a pessimist at all, I think there's some amazing things happening. For instance, material. There's been an explosion in new materials. And so the options that we have today to conventional products, to conventional plastics, to mined metals, I mean, it's just these markets are opening up. So, you should be encouraged. We're going to find a natural, organic alternative to most of the things that we're using today to construct and build our world. And we're going to create a market for that. And people are going to make a lot of money as we migrate these industries, back to one of your points, away from, what we've done historically that was destructive and wasteful to things that are more sustainable. That's going to be a really good market. And a lot of investors and entrepreneurs are going to do really well. And it's going to be better for the planet.
Do you see, could there be at some point in our lifetime a renaissance back to the localization and sort of the way things used to be?
Yeah, I think that, wow, that's a really interesting one. This concept of the way things used to be. If we weren't recording, I talked to you about the fourth turning, okay? Because it will reshape for you, Dan, how you think about this concept of the way things used to be. All right. So the answer for you is yes. And that some archaeologists or, I guess I would call them, they were authors, but a couple guys wrote a book in 1986 called The Fourth Turning. And they were curious about why do the millennials think differently than the baby boomers and the Gen Zs and the Gen Ys? What is that all about? So they went back, looked at 1900 and said, what can we learn from our immediate history? And they were like, wow, we learned that every long human lifetime, 80 to 100 years, there's a series of predictable events and attitudes that tend to correlate with the 3 or 4 generations that happen there. And so that pattern defined, the wealth disparity, the political sentiment at the time, whether there was a global or regional, war, what was happening in the stock market, how we felt about religion. And they were like, clearly we saw that for the 1800s. Let's go back to the 1800s. It existed in the 1800s. Let's go back to the 1700s. Wow. Let's look at Europe. Yeah. Let's look at Latin America. Great. Let's look at Asia. And they're like, all right. So when you say the way things used to be, I'm saying if you read the fourth turning and you look at the data that they amassed, right? And they tell you about these 4 cycles, you'll see that it will exactly get back to the way things used to be. And the current uncertainty, theological upheaval, questioning gender, questioning religion, musical taste, etc., is exactly the same pattern that was happening 100 years ago, and then 100 years previous to that, and 100 years previous to that.
So everything runs in seasons.
Yes, yes,
Well,
absolutely.
I can't wait for summer again because it's been we've been in winter for a little too long. I hope this is winter. I hope this is winter. So, as your current mission continues and expands globally, where do you see the most critical point of friction or bottlenecks in your work, whether it's data management, collaboration, process adoption that needs to be optimized to future proof, like a vision that you'd have for the future over the course of the next decade?
Yeah, I will tell you, for me, I think that we're on a predictable trajectory where we'll be using more technology. Things will be more data driven. They'll be more automated and thus autonomous. But the opportunity really hasn't changed, right? The opportunity to kind of engage. We learned something very important during Zoom is that as a species, we thrive when we can connect. There's a certain kinetic energy that we get when we get off the Zoom and get into the room. But
Yeah.
that's just not like endorphins, all right? It's just we were built, to kind of work in community type groups. And so I would say my concern is that we're going to sit further and further behind our GPT bots and our devices, and we're going to be allowing the machines to do it. And we're going to miss a lot of the magic that happens when you get two like minded people in a room thinking about how to impose their will and change the world. They might be Lewis and Clark, or they might be the Wright brothers. They could be anyone, but I'm telling you, there's nothing that
Yeah.
we have created in the past or we will create that rivals human ingenuity, but it is something kinetic. We have to get from behind the machines and the data and the algorithms and get people back together. So my concern is that we stop kind of coming together like this or however we can come together, because the moment we decide that it's easier to kind of let the machines do that proxy for us, that's when I get really concerned. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if we were in the same room right now, I'd give you a high five and a hug for saying that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, supply chain, we'll have that, kind of figured out. But so I'm not really concerned. The market forces, the ingenuity, it'll always work on some level.
So you've seen the world change, and in many ways, you've helped engineer that change. If you could go back in time and talk to your 25-year-old self, that young guy coming out of the Ohio State, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
Well, I think that I'm not entirely sure that I would go into, I would do supply chain. So here's what I would say. I would say that, I had an opportunity to go home and, bury a good friend not too long ago who never really lived, very far away from, kind of where he grew up. And, he's never been to the pyramids, never met the Dalai Lama, never did some of the things that I've been blessed enough to do. But from his early days to his last days, he was surrounded by the people that he cared the most about, and they cared the most about him. He never had aspirations to, change the world or do anything. He didn't, trot around the planet, making life safe for a $6 cup of coffee or the ability to buy your favorite widget. He had a very simple but powerful life. Okay. Ended up with 11 kids, and I don't even, can't even count the grandkids. But the point there is, I would tell my younger self to maybe stay a little closer to home, maybe not travel as much, right? Now, I would say still here, at 67, I'm just as excited and just as much a learner as I was when I was a young man, just as engaged. Always love supply chain. But, I think we kind of give over our passions, and we live through institutions to get our own personal passions. Stay local, and you can contribute as much locally as you can globally. I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think about the Harvard study that they did, where they sort of over the course of decades they
Yeah,
revisited the same cohorts, and the outputs of that study were the happiest people were the ones that were just surrounded by friends and family, right?
that's it. Yep.
Yeah.
For they just introduce themselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm sitting across from this amazing guy that's done a lot of amazing things. What do you want your legacy to be?
Yeah, I think it's going to be the supply chain project. I know it's going to be that I had to go these places and do these things and work at these other places and learn this other stuff and meet these amazing, amazing people so that I can arrive at this exact moment when we're at peak need and we're also at peak waste. And I could speak to it every day and twice on Sunday that there's a better way. And if I can bring people together, and I know a lot of people, and we can have a conversation, even for a moment between our kids and our whatever, if we can just really talk about how each of us can sort of contribute to kind of closing this supply demand mismatch, then I think I would have met my purpose and I'd be really pleased. But a lot of work to do right now. Something I'll tell you, working with an organization called Orchestral AI, and we're working together on a set of AI applications that are not just, effective and efficient from a supply chain perspective, but they're infused with the ability to not say, can we solve that problem with an algorithm, but should we solve that problem with an algorithm? And in solving it, what's a better outcome for humanity? And it's either how do we help as well as how do we not do additional harm? So stay tuned for Angelic Intelligence, my friend, Orchestral AI, the supply chain project. And I would suspect you're going to hear a lot about it over the coming weeks and months.
Well, this has been an inspiring conversation, Steve. I really appreciate it. I think the world needs more Steve Robinsons. And I think that this has been an absolute masterclass, not just on operations, but in purpose. So I really appreciate your contributions here today. I learned a lot, and I'm going to be rewatching this episode. For people that want to learn more about what you're doing, that are tuned in, what's the best way for them to learn more?
Yeah, they can, info at the supplychainproject.com. And I'd invite them to DM me, as well on LinkedIn, on our supply chain project page or my LinkedIn page. Okay.
And that's the supply chain project out.
That's correct. That's correct.
Well, Steve, I am blown away by this conversation. Thanks so much for the time today. And until next time, keep it real, everybody. Thank you.